The following story is from RookieDMDisaster.com. Character artwork by @Jarabel24.
MisFitters L.T.D.
Introduction. The sun was rising on the city of Waterdeep. Nariel looked at the gates, uncertain if this was the right thing to do. She had left behind her family and duties for a chance to see the world. Was she being selfish? She wasn't quite sure, but she came this far and wasn't ready to turn back now. She had heard that Waterdeep was a great hub for adventurers. There were supposedly always jobs to be done, and she wanted in on the action that was promised. Already, good fortune fell upon her as she walked past the threshold of the gates. She entered the gates to the field ward of the city and immediately saw a job board that was posted in the open square at the gates. One flyer on the board in particular read, "New adventurers wanted. Meet at the Dusty Dune Tavern and Inn located in Northward." It sounded great, and convenient at that. Only issue was not knowing where the Northward was located in the city. She decided to keep walking and ask someone for help. The city streets were still somewhat quiet and empty currently. There were only a few people walking about the streets, and they appeared to be going past a second wall that appeared to lead to a busier part of the city. She could see through the open doors of the walls several larger and more ornate buildings made of wood and stone. Before she went through, she noticed 3 men in a nearby alleyway. Before she went further in, she figured it would be a good idea to ask for directions. Nariel slipped in the alley to ask about the Northward. As she entered, one of the men broke away from the group and approached her. "Can I help you with anything?" the man said with a grin. "Sorry," Nariel said. "I'm new here. Do you know how to get to the Northward?" The man nodded. "Sure. Easy enough to get there." He noticed a bag strapped around shoulder of Nariel. He gestured to it with his head, arms crossed. "What do you have in the bag?" Nariel held back panic. The bag was filled with all the weapons she brought with her from her home. She wasn't sure if the laws here allowed carrying weapons in public. She put them in a bag to be on the safe side. "Nothing," she said, adjusting the bag to be at her back. He smiled. "That seems like a lot of pressure on your shoulder to just be an empty bag." He shook his head and started walking closer. "Look, I know we may be a small group, but we're not stupid." He brandished a knife. The 2 other men in the alley pulled out hand crossbows. "Give us the bag and you'll make it to Northwood, nice and safe." By this point, he was close enough for Nariel to hand him the bag. She panicked. Not sure what to do, she swung her bag at her attacker. An axe she had tucked away ripped through the bag, due to the force, and plunged into the man's chest. In an instant, he was on the ground. Nariel could not tell if he was alive or dead. "What's going on in there?" a voice called from the other side of the alley. Dashing in was a small gnome, wielding a sword, shield, and adorned with chainmail armor. The gnome dashed towards one of the crossbow-wielding thugs. Upon impact, she swept the legs out from under one of them with her shield, knocking him to the ground. She made no indication of stopping, while the one, still standing, could only watch in stunned silence. The gnome reached Nariel and saw the bloodied man on the ground.
"My name is Pumpek. Who are you? What happened here?"
Pumpek said. Nariel didn't know what to do. She only just got here. She couldn't have a run-in with the law already. She muttered almost to herself, "I'm sorry," and she fled the scene. Pumpek looked at the bleeding man and could see there was still life in him. She laid her hands on him, and a faint golden light glowed around them. The wound on his chest began stitching back together, and life pumped back into his veins. Pumpek let out a sigh of relief when his eyes opened.
"What happened?"
she asked.
She attacked us. We didn't do anything wrong. Don't arrest us.
"Oh, I'm not going to arrest you. I can't arrest you because I'm not a guard. I just roamed the city helping those who need it. Now, Do you promise not to try to mug anyone anymore?
They blinked a few times. Yes.
Great! Well, you three have a nice day.
She walked out of the alley with a smile plastered on her face. As she left, she spotted the same flyer Nariel had. After reading it, she thought to herself, adventure, and was on her way. 3 men looked on in awe as she left for the tavern. On the other side of the city, in a tavern called the Yawning Portal, was a sight not many would imagine seeing in their lifetime. A lone minotaur sat at the bar with a stein of ale. His name was Thorfreyr, and not many people paid him much attention. He couldn't tell if it was because they didn't care, or they didn't want to annoy him. Regardless, he enjoyed the time to himself to enjoy a drink. That was, until he heard someone near him trying to hide, saying,
Who let the battle cow in here?
Thorfreyr lifted his head and saw the man who said that. The moment they made eye contact, the man snapped his head away, and Thorfreyr knew he had his target. He stood up and walked to the table where the man was sitting with a group of 4. He picked up the man's drink, chugged it, slammed down the empty stein, and looked the man in the eyes.
It's Minotaur,
said Thorfreyr. He turned around and made his way back to the bar. With his back turned, he heard rapid scuttling as the table was cleared and the patrons vacant the building in an instant. Thorfreyr returned to his drink and looked at a flyer he picked up earlier about meeting at a tavern called Dusty Dunes. As the men ran out of the tavern, a blue dragonborn walked in with a deer carcass around his shoulders. He walked in and sat it on the bar. The owner, Magnus, walked over to him.
I'll be with you in just a moment, Valdora.
Valdora nodded and took a seat at the bar. Another patron walked in with an elk round their shoulders. They were far too covered up to tell what they were as far as race goes, but they were about the size of a thin human. She strode in, put the elk on the counter, and looked at the deer that was already there. She looked at Valdora and said, First time? Valdora looked disinterested. Without looking at her, he said,
No, just all that was out there today.
Clearly not, she said, gesturing to her elk. She walked away and leaned against the wall next to the entrance. Magnus returned and said,
Sorry about that. I just had to deal with the payments of some of the people checking out.
He looked at the deer and elk on the counter.
Well, would you look at that? You got 2 for me today.
Valdora shook his head.
No, the elk is hers.
He nodded his head back towards the woman standing near the door. She saw the gesture and started walking towards the counter.
All right, then,
said Magnus.
How does 10 gold for the elk and 8 for the deer sound?
The 2 hunters nodded in agreement. They accepted their payment and were on their way. On the way out, they both see a flyer. A call for adventure to meet at the Dusty Dunes Tavern and Inn for a job for adventurers. Both were always up for a little extra money from time to time. They decided independently to check it out to see what the job was. All the adventurers, for their own reason and curiosities, have decided to go to the Dusty Dunes. Perhaps seek riches and fame. Others may be in it just to help. And then there are those who just want to blow off steam. Regardless, all the adventurers make their way to the tavern for the promise of adventure.